My boyfriend hurled the ring at me after I said he must get a job before I marry him first. I met Colin when we were both 25 at a friend's barbecue, and he seemed normal at first. He said he was between jobs after leaving a tech company, and I thought nothing of it, since everyone has gaps in employment. We started dating, and he was charming and funny, and always available, which I loved since I worked long hours as a physical therapist. He'd cook dinner and keep the apartment clean, and I thought I'd found the perfect partner. 6 months in, I asked about his job search, and he said he was being selective about the right opportunity. A year in, he said the market was tough and he needed to update his skills. 2 years in, he stopped pretending to look. By year 3, Colin had fully settled into being unemployed. He'd wake up at noon, play video games until I got home, eat the food I bought, and complain that I worked too much. When I suggested he apply somewhere, anywhere, even part-time, he'd say traditional employment wasn't for entrepreneurs like him. He never started a business or had any entrepreneur activities, but he loved the title. His mom, Beverly, sent him money every month for his expenses, so he never felt pressure to work. She called it supporting his journey. I called it enabling, but kept that to myself. Colin moved into my apartment in year 4 without asking. He just slowly brought his stuff over until suddenly he lived there. He contributed nothing to rent or utilities, but had strong opinions about how I decorated. He'd invite his unemployed friends over during my work days, and they'd eat my food and leave messes. When I complained, Colin said I was being controlling about our shared space. It wasn't shared. I paid for everything. Year 7, Colin started talking about marriage. He'd point out rings in jewelry stores that cost 3 months of my salary. He'd plan elaborate weddings we couldn't afford unless I paid. He'd tell people we were practically engaged, and I had to correct them. He'd say after 10 years together, I owed him commitment. We'd been together 7 years, but he rounded up. Year 8, 9, and most of 10 were the same pattern. Colin would demand we set a wedding date. I'd say when he got a job, he'd say I was materialistic and didn't understand true love. He'd storm off to his mom's house where Beverly would feed him and agree I was being unreasonable expecting her special boy to work like common people. Beverly actually said common people. Last month was our 10-year anniversary, and Colin planned this big dinner at an expensive restaurant. I knew something was coming when he insisted I dress up and invited both our families. He got down on one knee with a ring I later found out Beverly bought and proposed in front of everyone. He gave a speech about how I'd supported him through his journey of self-discovery, and now it was time to make it official. Everyone was staring and waiting for me to say yes. I said I'd marry him when he'd been employed for 1 full year. Colin's face went red, and he said I was humiliating him. His friends booed me. Beverly called me a gold digger, which made no sense since Colin had no gold to dig. My sister laughed so hard she snorted wine. Colin threw the ring at me and stormed out. Beverly followed, calling me trash. The waiter asked if we still wanted our food. That's when I decided to fix this problem permanently. I knew Beverly owned 3 successful boutiques in town because she never shut up about them. I also knew she'd been complaining about staffing issues and unreliable employees. I called Beverly and apologized for the restaurant scene. I said Colin deserved better, and I wanted to make things right. I suggested Colin would be perfect for managing one of her stores since he had such an eye for quality and understood her vision. Beverly loved this idea. She said Colin had always been too special for regular jobs, but working for family was different. She immediately offered him a position managing her main location. Colin was furious when Beverly told him he started Monday. He said I'd manipulated the situation, but Beverly said this was perfect because now we could get married since he'd have a job. Colin tried to refuse, but Beverly said she'd stop sending money if he didn't take the opportunity she'd created for him. He had no choice. Colin lasted exactly 3 days. First day, he showed up at noon for a 9 o'clock start and said time was relative. Second day, he sat in the back playing games while customers waited. Third day, he told Beverly her business model was outdated and he could run it better if she retired. Beverly fired him on the spot and called him an ungrateful brat. She said I was right about him needing to grow up. She cut off his monthly allowance permanently. Colin came to my apartment begging for another chance. He stood there in my doorway looking like a kicked dog, bottom lip actually trembling like some kind of sad movie character. He said he'd change for real this time. He promised. He just needed one more chance to prove himself. I looked at him standing there in my apartment that I paid for, wearing clothes I'd probably bought, and something just snapped. I told him to collect his stuff this weekend because we were done. His whole face changed in like 2 seconds flat. The sad puppy look disappeared and his eyes went hard and his jaw got tight. He started yelling about how I'd manipulated him and ruined everything with his mom. He said I'd set him up to fail at the boutique on purpose. He said Beverly would never forgive him now, and it was all my fault. I just stood there letting him yell because, honestly, I'd heard it all before. When he finally stopped to breathe, I told him very calmly that he had until Sunday to get his things out. That's when he switched tactics again. He said he wasn't going anywhere because he'd lived here for years and had tenant rights. He said I couldn't just kick him out like some random person. He actually looked smug about it, like he'd found his winning move. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I said clearly into the camera that Colin had never paid rent, never contributed to utilities, and I wanted him out of my apartment immediately. His face went red when he saw me recording. He lunged for my phone, but I stepped back and kept filming. I told him if he touched me or my property, I'd call the police right now. He backed off, but kept yelling about how I was a heartless witch who'd used him for 10 years. I stopped recording and just stared at him until he ran out of steam. Then I opened the door and told him to leave. He stormed out, calling me every name he could think of, and I closed the door and locked it and stood there shaking. Then I called my sister. She answered on the first ring, and I could barely get the words out before she was cheering. She said she'd be over in 20 minutes with supplies. She showed up with 2 bottles of wine and a bag of fancy cheese and crackers she'd grabbed from the store. She hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe and said she'd been waiting 10 years for me to dump his lazy. But we sat on my couch and she poured wine into coffee mugs because I didn't own wine glasses since Colin always broke them. She asked what finally did it, and I told her about Beverly firing him after 3 days. My sister laughed so hard she spilled wine on my couch. She said it was perfect that his own mother finally saw through him. We spent the rest of the evening on my laptop looking up tenant laws. My sister kept reading sections out loud and getting more excited. She said since Colin never paid rent and wasn't on the lease, he had basically no rights. She said I could legally change my locks and put his stuff out. She said the recording I made was smart because it proved he acknowledged never paying rent. We made a plan for the weekend, and she said she'd help me box up his junk. Around midnight, she left, and I went to bed feeling lighter than I had in years. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. I grabbed it and saw 47 unread messages from Colin. The first few were apologies, saying he was sorry for yelling, and he loved me so much. Then they turned into threats about how I'd regret this, and he'd make my life miserable. Then back to love confessions about our 10 years together and how I was throwing away something special. Then more threats about tenant rights and lawyers. I screenshot every single message and saved them to a folder on my phone. Then I blocked his number. My sister called while I was making coffee and asked how I slept. I told her about the messages, and she said we should change my locks today instead of waiting until Sunday. She said Colin was clearly unstable and might try something stupid. I agreed and started looking up locksmiths who could come out on short notice. I found one who could come that afternoon, so I called work and told them I was taking a sick day. My boss sounded concerned and asked if I was okay. I said I had a personal emergency to handle and I'd be back tomorrow. He said to take care of myself and not to worry about the schedule. After I hung up, I started going through Colin's stuff. I grabbed garbage bags from under the sink and started in the bedroom. His clothes were everywhere, mixed with mine, so I had to sort through everything. I was shocked by how little he actually owned. For years of living here, and he had maybe 2 bags of clothes, most of them dirty. His video game stuff took up way more space. He had 3 different gaming systems and probably 50 games and all these controllers and headsets. I unplugged everything and started packing it into boxes I found in my storage closet. In the closet, I found a box of his stuff from when he first moved in that he'd never even unpacked. I taped it shut without looking inside. By the time the locksmith arrived at 2 o'clock, I had most of Colin's belongings boxed up and stacked by the door. The locksmith was this older guy named Frank who didn't ask questions. He just looked at my door and said he'd have new locks on in 30 minutes. I watched him work and felt this huge weight lifting off my shoulders. He installed a deadbolt and a regular lock and gave me 3 shiny new keys. He showed me how they worked, and I tested them about 5 times. Frank said the old locks were cheap anyway, and these new ones were way better. After he left, I stood in my apartment looking at those boxes of Colin stuff and feeling like I could finally breathe. For the first time in 4 years, this place was completely mine. No one else had keys. No one else could just walk in whenever they wanted. I sat on my couch and cried for like 10 minutes, and I wasn't even sure why. That evening, I was making dinner when I heard someone trying to put a key in my door. The key didn't work, obviously. So then Colin started pounding on the door. He was yelling about how I changed the locks, and that was illegal. He said he was calling the police on me. I didn't open the door or say anything. My neighbor from across the hall opened his door and told Colin to shut up or he'd call the building manager. Colin told him to mind his own business. My neighbor said he was already calling the manager, and if Colin didn't leave, he'd call the cops too. I heard Colin kick my door and then footsteps going down the stairs. My neighbor knocked and asked if I was okay. I opened the door and thanked him. He said Colin had been a problem for years with the noise and the friends coming over. He said he was glad I was finally doing something about it. After he left, I texted Colin through the door even though he was gone. I said his stuff would be in the hallway Sunday morning, and he needed to pick it up. I said if he came back before Sunday, I would call the police. He didn't respond. Sunday morning came, and I woke up early. I dragged all of Colin's boxes into the hallway and stacked them against the wall. There were 8 boxes total, plus 2 garbage bags of clothes. Like such a small pile for 4 years of someone's life. I took a picture of everything in case Colin tried to say I didn't give him his stuff. Then I texted Beverly. I said Colin needed to pick up his belongings today and included my address. I didn't expect her to respond, but she texted back within 5 minutes. She said thank you and that she was sorry for enabling him for so long. She said watching him fail at her boutique had opened her eyes to how bad things had gotten. She said she hoped I could find happiness without her son dragging me down. I stared at that message for a long time. I never thought Beverly would actually admit she'd been wrong. I texted back that I appreciated her honesty, and I hoped Colin would figure things out eventually. She sent back a thumbs up. Around noon, I heard voices in the hallway. I looked through my peephole and saw Colin with Dahlia and some other guy I didn't recognize. They were loading boxes onto a cart from the building. Colin came up to my door and knocked. He said my name real soft, like we were still together. He said he knew I was in there, and could we please just talk? I didn't answer. He knocked again and said he'd gotten a job interview and wanted to tell me about it. I stayed quiet. Dahlia told him to give it up and help them carry stuff. I heard them making trips up and down for about 20 minutes. Then Colin tried one more time. He said he loved me and he'd never stopped fighting for us. Then I heard them leave. I waited another 10 minutes before opening my door. The hallway was empty except for one box they'd missed. I kicked it toward the stairs and went back inside. I walked through my apartment and it felt bigger somehow, cleaner, like I could actually breathe without someone else taking up all the air. Monday morning, I went back to work and tried to act normal. My boss, Thaddeus, called me into his office around 10 o'clock. He asked if everything was okay because I seemed different. I sat down and told him I'd ended a 10-year relationship over the weekend. He nodded like he already knew something was up. He said he'd noticed my stress levels affecting my work for the past year or so. He said I seemed distracted during patient sessions and my notes had been getting sloppy. I felt embarrassed, but he held up his hand. He said he understood that personal problems affect work performance, and he wasn't criticizing me. He said now that I'd handled the situation, he hoped I could focus better. Then he offered me some flexibility with my schedule while I adjusted to being single again. He said I could take a long lunch if I needed to run errands or leave early on Fridays for a few weeks. I thanked him and promised my work would improve. He smiled and said he was counting on it. Walking back to my treatment room, I felt like maybe things were actually going to be okay. That afternoon, Evangeline texted me about lunch. She said she was taking me out whether I liked it or not. I met her at this sandwich place near the clinic, and she gave me a long hug before we even sat down. She ordered for both of us and then looked at me seriously. She said she needed me to promise her something important. I asked what, and she said I had to promise not to take Colin back when he came crawling back. She said she'd watched me support a grown man for 7 years while working 50-hour weeks, and she wasn't going to watch me do it again. I told her I was done for real this time. She made me say it 3 more times before she believed me. We ate our sandwiches, and she told me stories about her own bad relationships before she got married. She said leaving is always the hardest part, but staying would have been harder. I felt lighter after lunch, like someone was finally on my side completely. That night my phone rang with Beverly's number, and I almost didn't answer. We'd never been friendly, and I figured she was calling to yell at me again. But I answered, and her voice was different from I'd ever heard it. She said she wanted to apologize for calling me a gold digger at the restaurant. She said watching Colin fail at her boutique had opened her eyes to how right I'd been about him all along. She said she'd been lying to herself about his potential for years. Then she asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee sometime. I was suspicious because Beverly had never wanted anything to do with me except to criticize. But something in her voice sounded genuine, so I said yes. We made plans for Thursday after work. Thursday came, and I almost led 3 times. I kept thinking this was some trap or scheme to get me back with Colin. But I showed up at the coffee shop, and Beverly was already there looking nervous. She bought my coffee, and we sat down. She started talking immediately like she'd been practicing. She said she'd failed Colin by never making him face consequences for anything. She said every time he quit a job or gave up on something, she'd swooped in to fix it. She said she was in therapy now, trying to understand why she'd enabled him so badly. I sat there shocked because I'd never heard Beverly admit she was wrong about anything. She kept talking about how guilty she felt and how she'd ruined her own son by treating him like he was too special for normal life. I told her I appreciated her honesty. She looked relieved, like she'd expected me to yell at her. Beverly told me Colin was staying on her couch, and she'd given him until the end of the month to find a job and his own place. She said he was furious with her for the deadline, but she was trying to stick to it. Then she asked me for advice on how to stop herself from caving when he manipulated her. I was shocked she was asking me for help. I told her she needed to remember that helping him avoid consequences wasn't actually helping him at all. She nodded and wrote that down in her phone like she was taking notes. We talked for over an hour about boundaries and enabling patterns. When we left, she thanked me and said she hoped we could meet again. I walked to my car feeling weird about the whole thing, but also kind of hopeful that maybe Beverly was actually changing. 2 weeks went by, and I was settling into my Colin-free life. Then I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Colin using a new phone number. He said he was applying to jobs and really wanted to prove he could change. He said he missed me and thought about me every day. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to believe him, but I remembered what Evangeline made me promise. I texted back, once telling him to leave me alone, and then I blocked the new number. My hands were shaking when I did it, but I felt proud of myself for not engaging. The next day, my landlord, Maverick, knocked on my door. He said he needed to discuss lease renewal since mine was up next month. He told me rent was going up by $200. I did quick math in my head and realized without Colin's non-existent contribution, I'd need to adjust my budget. But then I realized I could actually afford it. I'd been paying for everything anyway, so losing Colin didn't hurt me financially at all. I told Maverick I'd signed the new lease. He printed it out right there, and I signed feeling proud of my independence. This apartment was mine, and I was keeping it on my own terms. That week, Evangeline invited me to a work happy hour. I almost said no, because I never went to those things. Then I realized Colin had always wanted me home after work, so I'd stopped socializing years ago. I told Evangeline I'd be there. The happy hour was at a bar downtown, and half the clinic staff showed up. I talked to colleagues I barely knew and had an amazing time. One of the other physical therapists mentioned her roommate was moving out if I ever wanted to split rent somewhere bigger. I thanked her and said I'd think about it. Walking to my car later, I felt like I'd rediscovered a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. Tuesday afternoon, my clinic receptionist called me out of a patient session. She said Colin was in the waiting room asking to see me. My stomach dropped, but I stayed calm. I told her to inform him I'd call security if he didn't leave immediately. She went back out, and I watched through the window. Colin was arguing with her and gesturing wildly. She kept shaking her head and pointing at the door. Finally, he stormed out and slammed the door so hard the glass rattled. I was shaking, but I felt proud I'd held firm and hadn't let him manipulate me into seeing him. I left work and drove straight to the police station. I filed a report about Colin showing up at my workplace after I'd told him to leave me alone. The officer taking my report was sympathetic. He said this was common when people finally left long-term, unemployed partners who'd been dependent on them. He helped me start the paperwork for a formal, no-contact order. The process took 2 hours of filling out forms and giving statements. When I finally left, I felt safer knowing everything was documented. If Colin tried anything else, there would be a paper trail. That night, Beverly texted me. She said Colin had told her I got him banned from my workplace. I tensed up waiting for her to yell at me. But her next text said she told him he deserved it for not respecting my boundaries. She said she was sticking to her end-of-month deadline despite his tantrums and manipulation attempts. She said he kept trying to guilt her, but she was remembering what we talked about. I texted back that I was impressed she was following through. She sent back a thumbs up and said her therapist was proud of her, too. I put my phone down, feeling like maybe things were actually going to work out. 3 weeks after kicking Colin out, I got my paycheck and stared at my bank account for a solid 10 minutes. The number was bigger than I'd seen in years. No Colin expenses meant actual money staying in my account instead of disappearing on his snacks and game subscriptions. I transferred half to savings right there and then looked up spa packages. I found a weekend retreat 2 hours away with massages and facials and a pool. The price made me wheeze, but then I realized I could actually afford it now. I booked it for next month and felt this weird mix of guilt and excitement. The guilt faded fast when I remembered all the times Colin said we couldn't afford things while spending my money on whatever he wanted. My sister showed up at my apartment Saturday afternoon with balloons and a cake that said, "Congratulations on your divorce." I told her we were never married, and she said that was exactly why we were celebrating. She'd invited Evangeline and 3 other friends without telling me. They all brought wine and stories. My coworker from the clinic said she'd been worried about me for 2 years, watching me get thinner and more tired. Evangeline admitted she'd wanted to shake me every time I made excuses for Colin. My sister's friend said her boyfriend had asked why I stayed with an unemployed guy, and she didn't know what to tell him. I had no idea so many people had been watching and worrying. Everyone raised their glasses and toasted to me, finally choosing myself. We ate cake and drank wine, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Monday morning, I woke up to a message request on social media from Dahlia. She wrote 3 paragraphs about how cruel I was for abandoning Colin when he needed support most. She said, real love meant standing by your partner through hard times, and I'd proven I never really loved him. She called me selfish and materialistic and said Colin deserved better than someone who only cared about money. I took screenshots of everything and blocked her immediately. Then I went through all my social media and made everything private. I texted Evangeline about it, and she called me laughing. She said Dahlia was probably panicking because, without me supporting Colin, he might start expecting his unemployed friends to help him out. She said Dahlia had been mooching off Colin, who had been mooching off me. So really, I'd been supporting his entire friend group. That made me feel better about blocking her. Beverly texted me, asking if I had time for coffee Thursday. I almost said no, but curiosity won. We met at the same place as before, and she looked tired. She admitted Colin had missed her end-of-month deadline and was still on her couch. She said he threw tantrums every day about how unfair everyone was being to him. She hadn't given him any money, but she was struggling with guilt about kicking him out. Then she surprised me by asking if I'd be willing to go to a therapy session with her. She said her therapist wanted to talk about enabling patterns and thought it might help if I was there since I'd been part of the situation. I didn't really want to, but she looked so desperate that I agreed to one session. The therapy session was weird. Beverly cried a lot, and the therapist asked her questions about Colin's childhood. Beverly talked about how Colin's dad left when he was 8 and she'd felt so guilty about the divorce. She said she'd tried to make up for his dad leaving by never saying no to Colin. The therapist pointed out that she'd accidentally taught Colin he didn't have to work for anything or face consequences. Beverly cried harder and said she knew she'd ruined her son by protecting him too much. She admitted she'd created an adult who couldn't function in the real world. I sat there feeling awkward, but also kind of sad for her. She'd been trying to help Colin, but had actually hurt him worse. The therapist asked me how Colin's behavior had affected me, and I talked about the 10 years of supporting him financially and emotionally. Beverly looked shocked when I listed everything I'd paid for. She said she didn't realize it had been that bad. By the end of the session, Beverly thanked me for coming and said she understood better now why I'd left. A month after the breakup, I realized I was sleeping through the night for the first time in years. I'd been waking up constantly before, stressed about Colin's mood or needs or complaints. Now I went to bed and actually rested. My apartment stayed clean because no one was leaving messes everywhere. My food lasted the whole week because no one was eating it without asking. I could watch whatever I wanted on TV without Colin complaining about my choices. I could make plans without checking if Colin needed anything. The relief was so big I almost cried. I hadn't realized how much constant stress I'd been carrying until it was gone. Every morning I woke up and enjoyed the quiet and the peace and the fact that I only had to worry about myself. Thaddeus called me into his office Wednesday afternoon, and I got nervous thinking something was wrong. Instead, he told me my work performance had gotten way better over the past month. He said he'd noticed I seemed more focused and energetic with patients. He offered me the lead therapist position on a new sports medicine program the clinic was starting. It came with a big raise and better hours and more responsibility. I accepted immediately without even thinking about it. Walking back to my treatment room, I realized Colin's presence had been holding back my career, too. I'd been too tired and stressed to take on extra responsibility or pursue promotions. Now I had the energy and focus to actually advance. Colin had been dragging down every part of my life, and I hadn't even fully understood it until he was gone. Colin left me a voicemail from another new number, saying he got a job at a fast food place and wanted to prove he could change. His voice sounded excited and proud, like he expected me to congratulate him. I deleted it without responding, but I did text Beverly about it. She called me back instead of texting. She said Colin had lasted exactly 2 shifts before quitting because the manager told him he couldn't sit in the back on his phone during rush hour. Colin said the manager had disrespected him and he wasn't going to work somewhere that didn't appreciate him. Beverly sounded tired and frustrated. She said nothing had actually changed with Colin and she didn't think anything would. He still believed the world owed him something just for existing. I told her I was sorry she was dealing with it, but I was glad I wasn't anymore. My spa weekend finally arrived, and I drove 2 hours to this resort in the mountains. I spent 2 whole days getting massages and facials and sitting by the pool reading books. No one needed anything from me. No one complained about what I was doing. No one made me feel guilty for spending money on myself. I realized this was the first real vacation I'd taken in 5 years. Colin had always said we couldn't afford trips, but what he really meant was I couldn't afford to pay for both of us. Now I could afford to treat myself, and it felt amazing. I sat by the pool Sunday afternoon before driving home and felt genuinely happy. Not just relieved or less stressed, but actually happy. I'd forgotten what that felt like. When I got home Sunday night, there was a letter in my mailbox from a law office. I opened it confused and then started laughing so hard I had to sit down. Colin's lawyer was demanding I pay him monthly support since we'd been in a common law marriage for 10 years. The letter used all this legal language about domestic partnerships and financial dependency. I laughed until I cried and then took a photo of it and sent it to my own lawyer. She called me back within an hour saying we had no common law marriage in our state and this was completely ridiculous. She said she'd send a response telling them to stop harassing me and that any further contact would be considered harassment. I went to bed that night, still giggling about Colin, actually thinking he could get support payments from me after refusing to work for 7 years. Beverly called me 2 days later, and I could hear the stress in her voice before she even said hello. Colin found the letter from his lawyer in her trash and confronted her about betraying him. She said he'd been going through her things, looking for money, and discovered the legal demand letter crumpled in her kitchen garbage. He'd screamed at her for hours about how she was supposed to support him against me. Beverly told him she was done enabling his behavior and he needed to move out of her house. Her voice cracked when she said it, and I could tell it had been hard for her. Colin packed his stuff and went to stay with Dahlia, which didn't surprise me at all. Beverly sounded relieved, but also guilty, like she'd failed him somehow. I reminded her that setting boundaries wasn't failure, and she'd done the right thing. She thanked me and said she'd call again soon. Evangeline cornered me at work the next day and said she had someone she wanted me to meet. Her husband worked with this guy who was single and employed and apparently very normal. I felt panic rise in my chest because I hadn't dated anyone but Colin in 10 years. The idea of sitting across from a stranger and making conversation terrified me. Evangeline saw my face and promised it was just coffee and completely casual. She set it up for Saturday morning at a cafe near my apartment. I spent the entire week nervous and almost led 3 times. Saturday came and I showed up 15 minutes early because I'm always early for everything. He arrived right on time and introduced himself and shook my hand like a normal person. We ordered coffee and talked about our jobs, and he actually had interesting things to say about his work. He asked me questions about physical therapy and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. The biggest thing that struck me was that he had his own apartment that he paid for himself. This felt like the absolute bare minimum for an adult. But after Colin, it seemed incredibly attractive. We talked for 2 hours, and when he suggested meeting again, I said yes immediately. Walking back to my apartment, I felt lighter than I had in years. Our second date happened 4 days later at a nice restaurant downtown. He picked me up from my apartment and opened the car door for me, which made me feel strange because Colin never did things like that. Dinner was amazing, and we talked about our careers and goals and future plans. He told me about a promotion he was working toward and asked about my plans at the clinic. Having a conversation with someone who had actual ambition felt refreshing and exciting. When the check came, he grabbed it before I could reach for my wallet. I almost started crying right there at the table because Colin never paid for anything in 10 years. Every meal and movie and coffee had come from my money, while he complained I didn't take him out enough. This man insisted on paying because he'd invited me, and it was such a basic thing, but it felt revolutionary. We sat in his car outside my apartment afterward and talked for another hour. He texted me the next morning asking when I was free for date 3. I saved the message and read it 5 times because I couldn't believe this was real. Colin messaged me from yet another new phone number that afternoon. He said he heard through mutual friends that I was dating someone and I was a terrible person for moving on so fast. The message went on for paragraphs about how I'd thrown away 10 years and never really loved him. He said I was heartless and cruel and he hoped I ended up alone. I read it twice and then screenshotted it instead of blocking the number. My lawyer had said we might have enough for a restraining order, and I wanted to keep collecting evidence. I forwarded the screenshots to her, and she called me within an hour. She said with all the documented harassment from multiple numbers, plus the workplace incident, we definitely had grounds for a restraining order. She asked if I wanted to file, and I said I needed to think about it. The idea of going to court felt scary, but Colin's messages were getting more aggressive. I decided to file for the restraining order 2 days later after Colin sent me 15 more messages calling me names. My lawyer prepared the paperwork and we filed it at the courthouse that Friday. The judge reviewed everything and granted a temporary order immediately. Colin would be served with papers and we'd have a hearing in 2 weeks for the permanent order. My lawyer said with all the documentation and witnesses, the permanent order should be straightforward. I felt relieved and terrified at the same time because I knew Colin would be furious when he got served. Walking out of the courthouse, I called Evangeline and told her what I'd done. She said she was proud of me for protecting myself and offered to come to the hearing for support. The hearing happened exactly 2 weeks later in a small courtroom with fluorescent lights. Beverly showed up without me asking her to, and I was shocked to see her there. She told the judge that Colin had been unstable and obsessive about me since the breakup. She described his behavior at her house and how he'd been harassing her too when she wouldn't give him money. Colin showed up late without a lawyer wearing sweatpants and a stained shirt. He tried to argue that we were basically married after 10 years, and I owed him a chance to work things out. The judge cut him off and said, "Living together doesn't create a marriage or obligation." She reviewed all my evidence, including the screenshots and witness statements. The judge granted the permanent restraining order and warned Colin that any violations would result in immediate arrest and jail time. Colin started yelling as the bailiff escorted him out, and I heard him screaming in the hallway. Beverly came over and hugged me and apologized for not seeing the truth sooner. 2 months passed and my life looked completely different. I was thriving at work with my new lead therapist position, and the sports medicine program was already successful. My relationship was healthy and equal, and I couldn't believe how good it felt to date someone who actually contributed. My apartment stayed clean and peaceful, and I never came home to messes or complaints. My savings account grew every paycheck instead of draining immediately. I was making plans for a future that didn't involve supporting a grown man who refused to work. Sitting on my couch one evening with a book and tea, I realized I was finally living my own life. No one needed anything from me unless I chose to give it. No one made me feel guilty for having boundaries. I felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. Colin violated the restraining order 3 weeks later by showing up at my clinic again. I was with a patient when the receptionist called my cell phone and said he was in the waiting room demanding to see me. I called the police immediately without hesitation. 2 officers arrived within minutes and arrested Colin right there in front of everyone. The receptionist told me later that he'd been screaming about how I'd ruined his life as they put him in the patrol car. He spent the night in jail and faced charges for violating the restraining order. Beverly called me that evening apologizing and crying. She said she was done making excuses for him and he needed to face real consequences. I thanked her for her support and told her she'd been brave to testify at the hearing. She said watching him get arrested was the wake-up call she needed to stop protecting him from himself. My boyfriend and I had been dating for 6 weeks when he mentioned over dinner that he'd gotten a promotion at work. I felt this surge of happiness for him and then realized I was dating someone whose career was actually progressing. We were both moving forward in our professional lives at the same time. He wanted to celebrate and insisted on paying for a nice dinner because it was his good news. This still felt wonderfully strange to me after 10 years of paying for everything. We talked about his new responsibilities and my expanded role at the clinic. Having a partner who understood ambition and career goals made such a difference. We celebrated together as equals, and it felt right in a way my relationship with Colin never had. Thaddeus pulled me aside at work the following week and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. We went to his office, and he told me the sports medicine program was exceeding all expectations. He said he was considering expanding my role even further with more staff and resources. Thaddeus credited my renewed focus and energy for the program's success. I thanked him for his patience during my difficult period with Colin and the breakup. He waved that off and said he was just glad to see me happy again. He'd noticed a change in me over the past few months and said I seemed like a completely different person. Walking back to my treatment room, I felt proud of how far I'd come in such a short time. Beverly and I started meeting for coffee once a month at this little place downtown. The first time felt strange because we'd never been friendly before, but sitting across from her, I could see how tired she looked. She told me Colin was staying on different friends' couches, and she hadn't given him money even when he called crying. She said she was proud of herself for holding the line, and I told her I was proud of her too. We'd both spent years making excuses for him, and now we were both learning to stop. She showed me a text where he'd blamed her for ruining his life, and she just replied that he was an adult responsible for his own choices. Hearing her say that made something settle in my chest because it meant she really was changing. We finished our coffee and agreed to meet again next month. 3 months after the breakup, my sister dragged me to the mall saying I needed new clothes. Standing in the dressing room, I realized everything I owned was old and boring because I'd never spent money on myself. For 10 years, every extra dollar went to groceries Colin ate or bills he didn't pay. I bought 3 new outfits and a pair of boots I'd been looking at for years. My sister took me to a salon where they cut 8 in off my hair and added highlights. Looking in the mirror afterward, I barely recognized myself. The woman staring back looked alive and happy instead of exhausted and defeated. My sister took a photo, and I posted it online and got dozens of comments from people saying I looked amazing. One friend messaged that she'd been worried about me for years and was glad to see me glowing again. The police called me 2 weeks later, saying Colin had been arrested for harassing his new girlfriend. Apparently, he dated her for 3 weeks before she broke up with him. And then he'd started the same pattern he'd done with me, showing up at her work, sending hundreds of messages, threatening to hurt himself if she didn't take him back. The officer said the girl was filing for a restraining order and asked if I'd be willing to provide documentation to support her case. I sent over everything I had, including the police reports and court transcripts from my own restraining order. The officer thanked me and said it would help show a pattern of behavior. I felt terrible for this girl who'd barely known Colin before he'd latched onto her. But I also felt relieved knowing his harassment wasn't personal or special to me. He did this to anyone who tried to leave him. My boyfriend and I took a weekend trip to the mountains, and I couldn't believe how easy everything was. He'd researched hotels and hiking trails and made reservations at restaurants. When the hotel bill came, he pulled out his card without me asking, and we split it exactly in half. At dinner, he didn't complain about prices or suggest we go somewhere cheaper. We divided every expense 50/50ths, and he never once made me feel guilty for spending money. Hiking together, he kept pace with me instead of rushing ahead or dragging behind. We talked about work and our families and future plans, and he actually listened instead of steering every conversation back to himself. Lying in the hotel bed that night, I thought about how this was what partnership was supposed to look like. Two people contributing equally and supporting each other instead of one person carrying all the weight. Beverly texted me the next week saying Colin had finally gotten a job at a warehouse. She said his friends had gotten tired of letting him crash on their couches, and one of them had basically forced him to apply. He'd been working there for 3 weeks, which was longer than he'd held any job in years. Beverly sounded cautiously hopeful, but also realistic about why he was working. She knew it wasn't because he'd suddenly developed a work ethic, but because he'd run out of people willing to support him. She thanked me again for helping her see how badly she'd been enabling him. I told her I was proud of her for maintaining her boundaries, even when it was hard. For months after the breakup, I pulled my credit report, expecting it to be a disaster. Instead, my score was better than I'd thought because everything had always been in my name only. Colin had never contributed to bills, so he'd never been on any accounts. I'd been so worried about him dragging down my credit, but he'd never even had access to it. I opened a retirement account that same day and set up automatic transfers from my paycheck. Looking at the account dashboard, I started playing with the calculator to see how much I could save by retirement if I contributed regularly. The numbers were actually good because I was starting relatively young and had decent income. For the first time in years, I was planning for my actual future instead of just surviving month to month supporting someone else. Evangeline and I were having lunch at work when she told me I seemed like a completely different person. She said I was lighter and more confident and smiled more easily. I thought about it and realized she was right. For 7 years, I'd been carrying the weight of 2 adults, working 50-hour weeks, and coming home to someone who contributed nothing. Now I was only responsible for myself, and it felt incredible. My apartment stayed clean because I was the only one living there. My food lasted because I was the only one eating it. My money was mine to spend or save as I chose. I could make plans without checking if Colin needed something. I could take on extra projects at work without worrying about him complaining I was never home. Every part of my life was easier and better without him in it. Maverick knocked on my door one evening and mentioned the unit next door was opening up next month. He said it was bigger with better light and asked if I'd be interested in transferring my lease. I walked through the empty apartment and fell in love immediately. The living room had huge windows and the bedroom was twice the size of mine. The kitchen had newer appliances and actual counter space. With my recent raise and no Colin expenses, I could easily afford the higher rent. I told Maverick I wanted it, and he said he'd draw up the paperwork. Walking back to my current apartment, I felt excited about the move. A fresh start in a place Colin had never lived sounded perfect. No memories of him lounging on the couch or leaving messes in the kitchen. Just a clean new space that was entirely mine. A mutual friend called me a few days later saying Colin had asked her to pass along a message. He wanted me to know he was sorry and hoped I was happy. The friend said he seemed different, quieter, and less angry than before. She thought he might finally understand what he'd lost. I thanked her for telling me, but said I wasn't interested in reconnecting with him. That chapter of my life was closed and I was moving forward. She understood and promised not to pass any more messages. After we hung up, I felt nothing about Colin's apology. No anger or satisfaction or curiosity about whether he'd really changed. He was just someone I used to know who'd wasted 10 years of my life. I hoped he figured himself out eventually, but it wasn't my problem anymore. Moving day arrived and my sister, Evangeline, and my boyfriend all showed up to help. We hauled boxes and furniture through the hallway and up one flight of stairs to my new place. My boyfriend assembled my bed frame while my sister unpacked kitchen boxes and Evangeline organized my bathroom. We ordered pizza and ate sitting on the floor surrounded by half-empty boxes. My boyfriend put music on his phone, and we danced around the empty living room laughing. This apartment was mine alone, earned by my work and paid for with money I didn't have to share. No one had keys but me, and no one could show up uninvited. Looking around at the people who'd supported me through the breakup, I felt grateful and free and ready for whatever came next. A few weeks later, Beverly texted asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. I almost said no because the idea of sitting across from her still felt weird, but something made me agree. We met at a little place near her main boutique, and she was already there when I arrived. She had her phone out showing photos to the barista, who was nodding politely. When Beverly saw me, she waved me over with this big smile that looked different from before, less forced, more real. She ordered us both lattes, and we sat by the window where afternoon sun made everything warm. Beverly pulled out her phone again and started scrolling through pictures of clay pots and bowls. She'd been taking a pottery class on Thursday nights and couldn't stop talking about it. The pieces were lumpy and uneven, but she seemed so proud of them. She said it felt good to make something with her hands instead of just managing employees and inventory. The class had other women her age, and they'd started going out for wine after. She showed me a group photo of them all covered in clay dust and laughing. I realized I'd never seen Beverly have friends before, just Colin and her boutique managers. She asked about my new apartment, and I told her about the bigger windows and the kitchen with actual counter space. She said it sounded perfect for a fresh start. We talked for over an hour, and it wasn't uncomfortable like I'd expected. We'd both set boundaries with Colin and survived it. That shared experience created this weird bond between us. When we left, she hugged me and said we should do this monthly. I agreed, because somehow Beverly had become something like a friend. 5 months had passed since I told Colin to leave my apartment. My boyfriend and I were having dinner at his place when he looked at me across the table with this expression I couldn't read. He put down his fork and said he loved me just like that. No big speech or dramatic moment. I felt my chest get tight, but in a good way. I said I loved him too and meant it completely. The feeling was nothing like what I'd had with Colin. That had been obligation mixed with guilt and exhaustion. This was based on actually liking each other as people. We split bills equally and made plans together instead of me doing everything while he complained. He had his own career and goals and supported mine, too. When I worked late, he didn't pout about it or make me feel bad. He just asked if I needed anything and told me he was proud of me. We finished dinner and did the dishes together, talking about normal stuff like what to watch on TV. Everything felt easy and balanced. I was learning what healthy love actually looked like, and it was so different from the 10 years I'd wasted. Monday morning, Thaddeus called me into his office before my first patient. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, but he was smiling. He said the sports medicine program I'd been leading was exceeding all their goals. Patient satisfaction scores were up and referrals had doubled. He wanted to make my position official as senior physical therapist and give me a whole team to manage. The raise he mentioned made me actually gasp out loud. It was more money than I'd ever made and finally reflected my experience and education. I accepted immediately, and Thaddeus shook my hand, looking genuinely happy for me. Walking back to my office, I realized something important. Colin's constant needs and complaints had kept me from pursuing promotions like this before. Anytime I'd considered taking on more responsibility, he'd whine that I already worked too much. He'd guilt me about not being home enough, even though he was unemployed and home all day. I'd turned down opportunities to keep the peace with someone who contributed nothing. Now I could focus on my career without that weight dragging me down. I called my sister during lunch to tell her, and she screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. That weekend, my sister invited me over for dinner with our parents. I hadn't seen them much during the Colin years because he'd always made family gatherings difficult. He'd complain the whole time or pick fights with my dad about politics. My sister pulled me aside while I was helping with dishes and said our parents had been talking about how proud they were of me. She said they'd watched me struggle with Colin for years and wanted to say something, but didn't want to push me away. They'd been scared I'd choose him over them if they criticized the relationship. Hearing that made me feel grateful and sad at the same time. I wish they'd said something earlier, but I understood why they hadn't. After dinner, my mom hugged me extra long and said she was glad I was taking care of myself now. My dad shook my boyfriend's hand and told him he seemed like a good guy. The whole evening felt lighter than family dinners had in years. I'd been so focused on managing Colin's moods that I hadn't realized how much stress I'd been bringing to every family event. The next Tuesday, I was at the grocery store picking up food for the week. I was in the produce section, looking at tomatoes when I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and there was Dahlia, pushing a cart full of frozen meals and energy drinks. She had this look on her face, like she was about to lecture me. She started talking about how Colin was really struggling and I should reach out to help him. She said he was living with different friends and couldn't hold down a job. I felt nothing hearing this information. I told Dahlia calmly that Colin was an adult responsible for his own choices. She tried to argue that I'd abandoned him after 10 years together. I put the tomatoes in my basket and told her I needed to finish shopping. She called after me that I was cold and selfish, but I just kept walking. Her opinion didn't matter to me anymore. Colin's friends had enabled him, just like Beverly had, and they could deal with the consequences now. I finished my shopping and drove home feeling completely unbothered by the encounter. That evening, Beverly sent me a text. Colin had gotten fired from the warehouse job for not showing up to his shifts. He'd called her asking for money, and she'd said no. He hadn't argued or tried to manipulate her, which surprised her. She thought maybe he was finally learning that actions have consequences. She sounded hopeful in the text, but also realistic. I wrote back that I hoped she was right, but I was glad it wasn't my problem anymore. It felt good to mean that completely. 6 months ago, I would have felt guilty or worried about Colin. Now, I felt nothing but relief that I'd gotten out. 6 months had passed since the breakup, and I was in the best shape of my life in every way. My savings account had more money than it ever had before because I wasn't supporting another adult. My career was thriving with a new promotion and team. My relationship was healthy and equal with someone who actually contributed. I was genuinely happy for the first time in years. I'd started going to the gym in the mornings before work and actually had energy for it. I'd been sleeping better without the constant stress of Colin's moods. My apartment stayed clean and organized because I was the only one living there. I could make plans without checking with anyone or worrying about complaints. Every single part of my life was better without Colin in it. My boyfriend and I were having coffee on Saturday morning when he brought up moving in together eventually. He said eventually specifically, not right away. After my experience with Colin, I was taking my time with any big decisions. I told him I wanted to make sure any move was a mutual choice with equal contribution. He said he completely understood and respected my boundaries. We agreed we weren't rushing anything and would talk about it more when the time felt right. The conversation was easy and comfortable. No pressure or manipulation or guilt. Just two adults discussing their future as equals. This was what partnership was supposed to look like. Friday night, I got dressed up and took myself out to a fancy restaurant. I'd made a reservation for one and requested a table by the window. The waiter seated me and handed me a menu without any weird looks about eating alone. I ordered an expensive bottle of wine and the best steak on the menu. Sitting there by myself, looking out at the city lights, I felt powerful. This was my money that I'd earned. My choice about where to eat and what to order. My freedom to do what I wanted without asking permission or dealing with complaints. When the bill came, I paid it myself without even checking the total. I raised my wine glass in a silent toast to myself for finally choosing my own happiness. The waiter probably thought I was weird, but I didn't care. I was celebrating 6 months of freedom, and it felt amazing. The following week, Evangeline and I met for lunch at our favorite sandwich place. We were halfway through eating when she told me something that surprised me. She said watching me leave Colin and rebuild my life had been inspiring. Her own family had boundary issues, and seeing me set firm limits gave her courage to do the same. She'd recently told her mom she couldn't drop everything to help with every small problem anymore. Her mom had been upset at first, but was adjusting. Evangeline said my transformation showed her that setting boundaries didn't make you selfish. It made you healthy. I felt proud hearing that my journey had helped someone else. The 10 years with Colin had been wasted, but at least something good came from me finally leaving. We finished lunch and walked back to the clinic together, talking about her plans to keep working on her family boundaries. I said, I promised to support her the same way she'd supported me. The next week, Beverly called me while I was organizing my closet. She told me Colin had packed up and moved to another state to stay with his dad, who he barely knew. Her voice sounded tired but lighter somehow. She said she was sad about how things turned out, but relieved to have her space back. She thanked me again for helping her see the truth about how badly she'd enabled him. We talked for almost an hour about her therapy sessions and how she was learning to set better limits. Before we hung up, we agreed to keep meeting monthly for coffee because our friendship had become important to both of us. I never expected to be friends with Colin's mom, but here we were. My boyfriend and I were cooking dinner together in my kitchen when he brought up his 5-year career plan. He wanted my input on whether he should take a management track or stay technical. We spent the evening talking about both our careers and dreams and how they could fit together. He asked about my goals for the clinic and whether I'd ever want to open my own practice. Having a partner who supported my ambitions instead of draining them felt completely different from anything I'd experienced with Colin. This was what an actual partnership looked like. We cleaned up the dishes together and split the cost of groceries without anyone keeping score or complaining. 2 weeks later, I got an email inviting me to speak at a women's professional group about work-life balance and setting boundaries. I almost deleted it, thinking they had the wrong person. But then I realized my story might actually help someone. The event was on a Thursday evening at a hotel conference room. About 40 women showed up, and I told them about leaving a 10-year relationship that was holding me back. I talked about supporting someone who refused to support himself and how long it took me to realize I deserved better. After my talk, several women came up to thank me. One woman said she'd been supporting her unemployed boyfriend for 3 years, and hearing my story gave her the courage to set a deadline. Another woman hugged me and said she needed to hear that leaving didn't make her selfish. Walking to my car that night, I felt proud that my wasted decade could at least help other women avoid the same trap. 6 months had passed since Colin threw that ring at me in the restaurant. Looking back now, I was actually grateful it happened because it finally pushed me to act. I wasted 10 years, but I had decades ahead to build the life I actually wanted. My apartment was mine with my name on the lease and my furniture and my rules. My money was mine to spend or save without someone else eating through it. My future was mine to plan without factoring in someone who contributed nothing. I was excited about all of it. I had a career that was growing, a relationship built on respect, friendships I'd neglected for too long, and freedom I'd forgotten existed. Some nights, I still got mad thinking about how much time I'd lost, but mostly I just felt relieved. The restaurant disaster was the best thing that could have happened because it forced me to finally choose.